Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, we'd like to welcome you to today's extended day-ahead market congestion revenue allocation phase 2 design working group meeting. My name is Christina Guibera, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I will be facilitating today's meeting. I'm joined in the room by Milos Boshtanak, Hillary Staver, James Lynn, and Guillermo Bautista Alderete. We're joined by George Angelides online as well. We just have a few friendly reminders today before we get started. Today's call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. This meeting is intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives. So please keep your comments professional and respectful today. And please also try to keep your comments and questions succinct so that we're able to hear from everyone. If you need closed captioning, you can access that on the bottom right hand of your screen, on your bottom left hand of your screen. And the Inteller Transparency Viewer is available on the bottom right of your screen. Just be sure to refresh it prior to viewing. And we welcome and look forward to your engagement and participation today. For raising your hand during the meeting, the raise hand icon is directly at the bottom of your WebEx screen. If you joined audio only, please press *3 on your device. And please do remember to state your name and affiliation first before making a comment. And also, after unmuting, please pause for about 2 seconds before speaking to ensure your audio connects clearly. Sometimes it cuts off at the beginning there, so please be mindful of that. And also, you may also send comments and questions via chat to all panelists. If you need any technical assistance during the meeting, please send a chat to the event producer and Inteller Events. Today we'll be hearing about meeting objectives and receive an introduction from Milos Boshtanak, and then Guillermo Bautista Alderete will introduce EDAM Phase 1 design analysis discussion, and then we will discuss the EDAM Phase 2 design principles and also upcoming design workshops before we wrap up for the day with next steps. So with that, I will turn things over to Milos to get us started.
Thank you, Christina, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us on a Monday afternoon. We try to find better dates, but it was either a Monday or a Friday, and we thought better to start it on this topic than to end it. So thank you again for taking the time to join us. This is a follow-on working group discussion from our December meeting where we kicked off phase 2 of the initiative. And what we wanted to do today was follow on to that discussion based on the stakeholder comments that we received and look to close out some of these items to allow us to move then to the next stage where we start focusing on identifying and discussing more substantive design alternatives. So the objectives for today's discussion is to review the stakeholder comments that we received on that December 11th workshop, both on the phase 1 analysis that Guillermo provided and the phase 2 design principles that we introduced during that December workshop. Then we wanted to address some of those stakeholder questions on that phase 1 analysis, and we have a presentation from Guillermo to walk us through some of the key aspects of the comments that we received and effectively address those comments. We then wanted to shift to discussing and putting some kind of final alignment around the phase 2 design principles and identify any updates that we may have made in response to those stakeholder comments. So we'll talk through each one of those individually and identify, based on the comments, where we've made any kind of suggested updates. And again, we'll take feedback on those as well. And then finally, as we close the meeting and depending on where we are, we want to set expectations for the next stage of the working group discussions where once we've aligned as much as we can on these phase 2 design principles, then putting those principles into action by looking at potential different design alternatives that support either additional enhancements to the phase 1 design that's going to be in place for EDAM launch, or looking at longer term designs for congestion revenue allocation in EDAM. We go to the next slide. just a little bit of recap again to ground us where we are and the scope or the intent of phase 2 of the initiative. As you may know, if you participated in phase 1 of the initiative, we established a design for congestion revenue allocation for the EDAM go live, and we explicitly recognize that design as being transitional in nature. And it allows then room for us to work with stakeholders informed by some of the data that Guillermo is going to talk about a bit later, but also informed by operational experience and these workshops that we're starting. It allows us to then consider any additional near-term enhancements to that design and a long-term durable design to move away from that initial design that is going to be in place when EDAM launches in May of this year. So this phase 2 initiative then is going to look at any near-term enhancements, some of which we introduced for consideration within the phase 1 initiative, as well as long-term designs, and we welcome stakeholder ideas and input on the different range of options that we can look at in addressing issues related to congestion revenue allocation. Some of the key issues that we committed to evaluating in this phase 2 as part of the first initiative, and these are by no means exclusive issues that we want to address, but I think these are the most important that kind of guided our need for phase 2 of the initiative. But one of them is looking at enhancements and long-term designs that eliminate or reduce any self-schedule incentives and support robust economic bidding in the construct of congestion revenue allocation. And then secondly, looking at designs that create the symmetry and allocation of these parallel flow congestion revenues and congestion revenues overall between the CAISO balancing area and other balancing areas, recognizing there's a little bit of a difference in underlying transmission structures under both the CAISO balancing area, which doesn't have the OAT construct and has CRRs or congestion revenue rights in managing congestion hedging, and contrasting that with other EDAM balancing areas that have explicit OAT transmission sales, and finding a symmetry in the allocation design based on those two different constructs. We have a phase 1 design that's in place, but again, this phase 2 is looking at improving on that symmetry and creating a symmetry on a long-term basis, or looking at near-term enhancements to that structure of the design. If we go to the next slide. Before we jump into some of the more substantive aspects of the different topics that we'll cover, the analysis and then the design principles, I wanted to just take a moment here to acknowledge the different stakeholder comments and some of the key themes that we'll spend a little bit of time on as we get into the more substantive discussions. But I wanted to have kind of this introductory summary slide just to give a sense of what we heard from a thematic perspective overall. But on the December 11th workshop, where we talked about an initial analysis that Guillermo shared, and then the design introduced some initial design principles, we received 13 sets of stakeholder comments. The stakeholder comments on the analysis that Guillermo shared, that's based on EIM data and is trying to really contextualize what are the effects of constraints between the CAISO and Pacificor based on that EIM data that can inform us as we look towards phase 1 implementation. Guillermo shared that analysis, and we received some of the stakeholder comments that Guillermo is further going to address in his presentation. But some of the themes of those comments on the analysis is that stakeholders suggested or used that analysis as a platform to suggest additional reporting and data on parallel flow effects and associated constraints, particularly across the CAISO balancing area. Not as much or not as only focused on CAISO and Pacificor, but more broadly looking at the different constraints across the CAISO balancing area and its effects associated with other balancing areas and parallel flows from those balancing areas. Some of the comments also requested to more clearly articulate the key takeaways from that initial analysis based on EIM data that Guillermo shared, some of the conclusions and implications from that analysis. And you'll see later, Guillermo is going to cover that as well, try to provide some of those key takeaways and implications. And then a key third theme related to that analysis was more of a request to quantify the effects of these loop flows or parallel flows on CRR revenue adequacy, as well as more broadly use that data if possible to quantify the amount of congestion revenues that would be allocated between the CAISO and Pacificor based on that initial data analysis. And again, Guillermo is going to cover that a little bit more in his upcoming presentation. In terms of stakeholder comments on the Phase 2 design principles, which was also a substantive theme of the December 11 workshop, the comments that we received demonstrated broad support for the introduced principles. There were some requests for further clarification and some tweaks to a couple of the principles that we'll be prepared to talk about that today, and those are very helpful comments that I think will be good to focus on today when we get to that design, principle design section of the discussion. We'll be prepared to spend some time on those, walk through those, and rationalize them again in light of the comments. But broad support for those introduced principles with some of those clarifications that I hope that we can work through today and try to address as much as possible. There were a number of questions as well throughout, the smaller questions throughout the comments, that some of which we try to address offline rather than bringing each question here, and we're still doing that. But to the extent that you don't see some of your questions reflected directly within the upcoming slides, feel free to jump into the queue and raise your hand, and we'll be happy to answer those as much as we can. I encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. Be curious about the principles as well. Ask any clarifications. I think ultimately what I'm hoping, particularly on the principles, is that today we can walk out of the room aligned as much as possible, recognizing the broad support that we have already at this stage, aligned as much as possible, and making the necessary clarifications to the two principles, I think, that stakeholders sought some clarification. So feel free to ask questions, chime in, share your perspective, and I encourage you to ask as much as you can across both of these sections. So before we turn it over to Guillermo, let me just pause here and just see if there are any initial questions before we jump into the Phase 1 analysis of the presentation and answering some of the stakeholder comments and questions and framing the next stage of the analysis.
Taking a look, I'm not seeing any raised hands at this moment. Just a reminder that you can raise your hand at the bottom right of your screen or right into the chat if you're having trouble raising your hand. So with that, I'll pass it over to Guillermo.
Thank you, Guillermo.
Thank you, Milos. Thank you, Cristina. Thank you for all the comments that you submitted regarding the analysis. These are very useful to give us some perspective of what areas we can improve and expand to what we originally envisioned. And we put a few slides just to walk through the main items that we received from the comments. We can go to the next slide, Cristina. Just to reiterate where we are. We have committed to provide analytics in the context of the congestion revenue allocation methodology, the revised version that we're going to go live with. And part of the scope is to assess the implications of that methodology, the type of incentives this may create. And ideally, we want to have a good picture of that before we go live, so that we cannot get surprised by the time we go into production and realize of the actual implications of having this methodology. Part of the commitment that the ISO did was to undertake this effort prior to go live. And that is what we organized in two phases. The third phase is business as usual, when we're going to be continuously assessing the market performance once we are in production. That is a post-go live. Now, in regards to the first two stages, we structure the analysis to be sequential, so we can build up the story of what we have analyzed. In the first stage, that is the information that we posted in the report back in December, and that we also walked through in the last stakeholder meeting. The main point of that first set of analysis was to really provide a context, to paint the landscape of how congestion historically has been within the EIM footprint. It is a real time. It's not a full replication of what the EDAM is going to be. They are different footprints, different elements of the design, but it's the best reference we can have lacking actual operational data from the EDAM. And this first phase was summarizing the analysis that we posted and really goes into what I call the structural conditions for congestion in the system. And this is different to trying to understand the bidding incentives or the type of participation we may have in the market. Is simply referring to structurally, given the transmission configuration, what type of congestion, the direction, what constraints are expected to be binding in the context of the real time. And obviously, there's going to be a reference to extrapolate to potentially what could be in the day-ahead market. We have received several comments during the call, in the previous round of comments regarding moving into the next stage, that is trying to get an estimate of the potential impact of this revised policy. And when I mean potential impact, it's really about the dollars implications. We have indicated that that is still part of the plan for the second stage, that by the way is right now what we are doing, and we are expecting to post later this month, predicated on the analysis that we have done from the first stage. We are also expecting to use, to some extent, not too heavily, the simulation that we already have for the EDAM. We already have the parallel operations. We are generating some actual cases with the information that is available that could give us at least a reference to cross-check how that type of solution looks like relative to the conditions that may be present in the real time. We are going to be complementing the analysis based on historical EIM data with some limited simulation data from the EDAM. And obviously, once we go live, we are going to be dealing with actual operational data, and then we can really have a more precise analysis and assessment of the costs that are involved with this revised methodology. Next slide, please. Now, the timing for this discussion is pretty interesting because regardless of the pace and the schedule of the stakeholder process for the congestion revenue allocation, we are already on track to perform this analysis based on the previous feedback that we received from market participants, from the Market Surveillance Committee, from the governing body market experts about spending and doing an additional analysis to understand the impact of the revised methodology. We just leverage the last opportunity that we have for the CRA stakeholder process to socialize the analysis that we were doing. And we have committed to continue to do this even after we go live. Now, given the fact that this was actually a plan already underway before even we formally initiated this CRA stakeholder process, we had defined a very narrow and specific scope for this analysis. The first phase was more generic across the EIM market. The second part of the analysis, you may recall, starts to go into specifically the EDAM footprint for the go live that consists of the three balancing areas of PAC East, PAC West, and the ISO balancing area. And therefore, that was our reference for what type of analysis we would be doing, because the intent was to assess what type of issue we could face by the time we go live. Originally, this intent was not for the general purpose of the CRA stakeholder process. Again, we just leveraged on the timing to socialize this analysis in the previous opportunity of the stakeholder meeting. And we are complementing this historical information of the EIM with information of parallel operations, and that is the reason we are operating in this time window between now and before the go live. Next slide, please. Now, this is relevant because there are some comments, and these are well taken, in general asking for expanding the scope, providing additional information, covering additional balancing areas. I can understand that within the general context of the congestion revenue allocation methodology discussion, that makes sense. And again, I just want to emphasize the original intent was really narrow to the go live to address the request and the inquiry that we got for assessing this prior to go live. There are at least 4 groups of comments that we received from the previous round of the CRA. One of them is asking for more clarity about what is the key messages from the first phase of the analysis that we presented in December. The second one is going into the request for putting dollar values to that analysis that I indicated is still part of the second phase. And there is also a set of comments suggesting that we expand this to try to make the connection between all this discussion of the congestion revenue allocation and the implications this may have for the CRR revenue adequacy and all the discussion that is happening in the CRR space. The last piece is more generic because it goes into asking for either additional data, additional reporting, or additional scope into the analysis that we have in mind for this 2-stage pre-go live. And let me just elaborate a little bit on each of those 4 points. We can go to the next slide, please. Going back to the first item, what are the key messages from the first stage of analysis that we performed? As I indicated, the overall idea of this first stage was to set the context, providing a lot of reference information of historically how the congestion actually plays out in the footprint of the EIM market, because that is the best reference we can have when it comes to try to project what may happen once we are in the EDAM market. I refer to this very specifically to be a structural type of assessment because it doesn't depend on the type of bidding, it doesn't depend on the type of participation. It largely refers to the structure of the transmission system that is part of the EDAM footprint. How the connectivity, how the transmission constraints located in either PAC East, PAC West, and CAISO are interacting given different injections and withdrawals at different points of the system. These are going to be present regardless how participation is in the market because they are inherent to the transmission configuration of the system. Yes, there may be outages here and there that may change slightly the configuration of the transmission system and may result in a slightly different outcomes of the congestion. But again, this first stage was to really give you the bare bones condition of, given the transmission configuration that we have, what is the type of congestion we are expecting to see. And we came short to put a value, a volume, because again, it's not about the participation, it's about how we are configuring the transmission system in the EDAM footprint. Out of that structural assessment that we did, that basically rely on information of congestion experienced in the EIM market for 2024 and part of 2025, we found that there is an asymmetry given the different conditions of the different balancing areas in the EDAM footprint, in which transactions that may realize in the Pacific Corporation areas can have a very material impact on parallel flows for transmission constraints in the California ISO area. Again, that is granted just given how the transmission system is configured in the EDAM footprint. We don't go to the extent of the dollar value or the volume impact of those, but structurally, that is what is going to happen. The converse picture of this is that transactions in the California ISO area are going to have basically the minimum effect of parallel flows in the Pacific Corporation area constraints. That is the asymmetry I was referring to. And if you want to see this conclusion in terms of the prices may have other factors to account for, like how expensive participants are bidding to price the congestion in a certain way. But it keeps the structural conditions of the congestion. And the main takeaway is that the congestion happening in the California area is going to have a significant impact of prices in the PAC areas. And the other way around, congestion happening in the PAC areas is going to have minimum effect on prices for elements located in the California balancing area. I want to emphasize one more time, this is highlighting the structural configuration of the transmission system. Now, how big, how large these impacts are going to be? Well, it's going to depend on the volume of the transactions. It's going to depend on how participants are bidding, how expensive or cheap the bids are in the system, because that is going to set the price for the transactions. But the underlying configuration of the transmission system and the inherent dynamics of how the power flows within the EDAM footprint is going to reflect the configuration that we have for the EDAM, which the EIM market can do a relatively good job in projecting how those interplays are going to happen in the EDAM. That is the main takeaway that we intended to have for the first phase of the analysis. Let me pause and see if we have any questions, and we can take it now.
We do have one question in the queue from Michelle Quito. Go ahead, Michelle. Can we try unmuting Michelle one more time, please?
Hey, this is Michelle Quito from the Energy Division. Hey, I just want to make sure that I understand this. So I think what I read here is that you're saying that the Pacific Core has large effects on our parallel flows, but small effects on prices. Is that what you're saying here? And then I want to make sure I understand the other way.
The first part is right, Michelle. I couldn't catch the second part when you referred to prices. Could you please repeat?
Well, I thought you said large effects on parallel flows, but small effects on the prices in CAISO. Is that a good understanding of what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, but then you're also saying that CAISO has small effects on parallel flows in PAC, but large effects on prices?
Right.
Okay, and just intuitively, why would you have large effects on prices if you have very small effects on parallel flows?
Yeah, there is no misalignment on this statement, Michelle. Let me try to explain. If you have a lot of congestion in the CAISO system, and there are resources in PAC area that are effective for that congestion, all that congestion that is originated in the CAISO system is going to show up in meaningful prices in the PAC area. Okay,
so it doesn't affect the parallel flows, but because of the path of the resources, you get more congestion in PAC because of congestion in CAISO, is that right?
No.
Okay.
Let me try in a different way.
Okay, thanks.
Let's say we're analyzing congestion in the CAISO system, and we have quite a lot of congestion in the different constraints in the CAISO balancing area.
Yep.
Now, in order to manage that congestion, we have to redispatch resources not only in the CAISO balancing area, but also in the PAC area. So effectively, we're going to move around resources in the PAC area to address congestion in the CAISO area. By virtue of that congestion management, prices in PAC resources are going to reflect that material congestion that is happening in the CAISO system. So the result is that, yes, PAC transactions have an impact on parallel flows on the CAISO system, and the complementary conclusion of that is that, therefore, the CAISO congestion is going to be reflected in PAC prices.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michelle. Next in the queue, we have Doug Boccignone. Go ahead, Doug.
Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. Sort of a follow-up to Michelle's question. I think what's making it difficult for me to understand is the terminology. This congestion sourced in one area or the other. What you're saying is that there's constraints within an area that are affected by injections or withdrawals in another area? Is that what
Yes.
you mean by sourced?
That's correct, Doug. What this means is that you have a market footprint that consists of different balancing areas. There will be constraints located within each balancing area. Within CAISO balancing area, we may have PAT 26, PAT 15. These are constraints that are located within the CAISO balancing area, and therefore when they get congested, that congestion is going to be sourced from CAISO constraints.
Okay. I think it might be easier to understand if you talked about the constraints, because it makes sense to me, like that the Pacific Corp transactions can have relatively large parallel flow impacts on constraints in CAISO, and that's why they're impacted by their prices are impacted by those constraints, whereas the converse, the transactions in CAISO don't have large parallel flow impacts on constraints in Pacific Corp, and therefore don't have big price impacts in CAISO.
That's correct. I think the nomenclature we are trying to use here is relevant to the discussion of parallel flows versus native flows. Yes, you have resources in PAC area that are dispatched to manage congestion in PAC constraints. It is contained within the same balancing area. These are native flows generated by their own resources. But when there are a dispatch of resources in one balancing area to manage congestion in another balancing area, that is when we are start to make a difference whether that constraint is in the same area where the resources are dispatched or in a different area, because it's very relevant to the parallel flow discussion.
Yeah. Thank you. That helps.
Thank you, Doug. And I'm not seeing any other questions in the queue at this time.
Okay, let's move on to the next item. And that is the concurrent request to move into the second stage to provide some type of impact. And yes, that is within the schedule, that is within the scope of the second stage of the analysis that we have committed to perform. And this is the analysis that we're indeed doing. And let me give you some preview of that. We are right now doing the analysis of the dollar impact. That is going to be based on historical congestion, prices, and schedules from the EIM market, limited to the EDAM footprint that we're going to have for the go-live. Effectively, we are reducing the analysis for the areas of PAC East, PAC West, and the ISO balancing area. Can we expand that for other balancing areas? Yes, for sure, and we are open to have that as part of this wider effort of the CRA discussion. But again, just want to emphasize the objective that we have to begin with for prior to go live. Now, this is a little bit complicated because we have been very hesitant to put a dollar value there that can be taken as a perfect foresight of what the cost of the EDAM is going to be. We don't have the conditions, the data to be able to have that crystal ball assessment of what the dollar is going to be once we go with the EDAM. What we are using is the historical information of the EIM market to make a reasonable approximation, and not a precise approximation. It's more like upper bound, right? If we set all the more stringent conditions, what is the high value that we can get out of this, assuming the congestion happens all the time in the way that it already happened for the historical conditions of the real time. And it's not perfect, but this is the best information we can have, the most reliable information we can have of simply using the real-time information. And it's going to be a dollar impact assessment that we are finalizing. And we're expecting to actually provide the first discussion of those estimates next week in the upcoming Market Surveillance Committee meeting. I believe now it's scheduled for March 6th.
March 6th, yeah.
So we're going to preview that information there, and in a matter of 1 to 2 weeks after, we're expecting to post the report with a more detailed analysis of that. But that is coming. We recognize the interest and the importance of having some type of quantification dollar-wise, right? Because the first phase was more about understanding how things can happen, how they may evolve, but not having a meaningful dollar value. It may handicap the assessment of, is this big enough or small enough to be an issue? And that's coming. That's all what I wanted to say for next week. Next slide, please. Then there is this other item related to request for additional scope and data, including more frequent reporting, including additional areas of analysis to be reporting on, like specific parallel flows. I want to make sure that we are conveying the right message. We are not saying no to any of this. I simply want to differentiate between the short-term effort that we have right now to get this done for the go-live, prior to go-live for PAC and CAISO balancing areas, and then as the discussion of CRA plus the discussion of congestion revenue rights evolved, we are more than happy and committed to continue assessing the need to provide analytics to guide the discussion and provide a reference of what is meaningful to guide the discussion of these important stakeholder processes. There are many metrics to elaborate on relationships between CRA and CRRs, for sure. These are of importance for us. It's a matter of how we can strategize to get a package that meets both needs of the CRR and the CRA efforts. So this is not the end. We just want to finish this short-term goal that we have for the analysis of pre-go live, and then more than happy to continue to be engaged to develop additional analysis to support the CRA. As part of the go live planning that we are doing, there will be additional information that we are scheduled to have, in addition to typical information you can find for yourself for resource participation, such as those in CMRI or public information on OASIS. We have committed to have a very frequent cadence of reporting. We are going to have these monthly performance reports for at least for the first 6 months to assess the overall performance of the EDAM, which obviously includes key elements of this CRA assessment, how the congestion rents, the retribution of those rents go back to the entities, what constraints are causing, what parallel flows. All that information is going to be part of that monthly performance report. In addition to that, we are expecting to have a daily report. For some of you, this is not news because we already have a daily market watch where we put some key metrics for the day-ahead market the day after we run the market. We are expanding that report to be more appropriate for the EDAM scope, and we are expecting to include 1 or 2 metrics related to congestion revenue allocation. That information would be basically readily available the next morning after we run the day-ahead market, just for awareness. And then we're going to be collecting and providing more assessment of that through the monthly reports. These are the plans that we have for socializing more timely, more frequently the information of the CRA as part of the overall plan for the EDAM Go Live. And I believe this is the last slide I have for this part. Maybe we can pause and see if we have any follow-ups or questions.
Thank you, Guillermo. Taking a look at the queue, I'm not seeing any hands raised at this time. So we'll turn it over to...
Thank you, Guillermo, and stakeholders, to the extent that any questions come up after the call, feel free to reach out to us. directly, either through your customer service representative, or if you have any of our emails, we'll be happy certainly to answer any questions on any aspect of this presentation. So thank you with that, Guillermo. As part of the next phase of this discussion today, we wanted to focus on the design principles that we introduced back in December and that stakeholders commented on in the meetings that we're doing in mid-January. I do want to acknowledge here, and I'll turn it over here shortly to Hillary to kind of frame some of the key themes from those comments, but we do have, and I think this is a good opportunity to highlight a commitment that we made as well in phase one of the initiative to have close collaboration between the EDAM congestion revenue allocation team and the initiative with the CRR enhancements team and initiative. We recognize the relationships are there in that the congestion revenue allocation initiative really is establishing an allocation of congestion revenues between balancing areas, and then the CRR enhancements initiative ultimately takes some of those inputs and will ultimately identify, depending on the design that we have here, it may impact how some of those revenues are allocated through the CRR process in the CAISO. But we're not yet at that design phase here in congestion revenue allocation phase two. That will be coming as part of the next workshops. But just wanted to emphasize the cross-pollination between our teams. We have Hillary here, James, Lynn, George, myself. We're also on the CRR team, and there's a number of, and they are also, James and George are also on the CRR initiative team. So we're coordinating very closely, and that's why it was important for us to look at these principles through that broad lens, the CRR lens and the CAISO and the Congestion Revenue Allocation Initiative lens, and we've been collaborating on reviewing the comments, summarizing them, and then providing any kind of changes to them that we'll go over today. With that context, I'll turn it over to Hillary just to highlight some of the themes from the comments on the phase two design principles. Go to the next slide.
Thank you, Milos. So let's talk a little bit about the themes that we saw in those 13 comments that we received on the initial principles. And the structure that we're going to take in this section is, as Milos said, I'll review some of the overarching themes, and then I'll hand it back to Milos, and we will go back through each of the principles individually and talk about some specific red lines that we've introduced to try to address some of these questions and requests for feedback. Overall, what we saw in the comments on the initial principles is that they seem to hit the mark. We saw overall support for these initial principles as being a good starting point for guiding phase two, with some requests for clarification on some specific areas and principles. One of those areas that we saw come up the most in the comments is the request for clarification around the principles that frame the continued sale and administration of OAT rights, and a question about how to phrase that such that it doesn't preclude consideration or any potential outcomes of the longer-term design question, including a market-wide CRR design. So we have taken that into account, and you'll see as we go through the principles, especially on principle 3, we have some additional language and clarifications that can help address that. And then finally, another thing that we heard a couple different times, some suggestions for further smaller clarifications, and also being explicit about, in the discussion of mitigating cost shifts, what entities we are talking about mitigating cost shifts between, and specifically a question of whether we're referring to EDAM balancing authority areas. So we will address that as well, but the hope is that given the feedback that we received on the December meeting, we may be most of the way there on these design principles, and we'll have an opportunity for feedback and discussion here to see if anything that we added to these updated versions gets us to where we need to be. So I'll pause there. Does anybody in the room here have anything you'd like to add, or any stakeholders, anything that you would like to add about other themes you saw or raised?
I'm not seeing any hands raised from stakeholders. Anyone in the room have anything to add?
No, nothing for me. Thank you, Hillary.
All right. Well, then, let's go through the principles one by one. And for that, I will hand it back to Milos.
Thank you, Hillary. So, as she noted, we'll go through each one of these one by one. I'll pause at each one of them, and by all means, feel free to ask any questions. I think we want to be thorough through these, any additional tweaks that we need to the language. There will be opportunity to comment as well, as you see in the next steps, any additional tweaks to the principles coming out of this meeting, to the extent that you don't get to ask your question or don't think of any suggestions on the spot. But as Hillary said, I think we're close on the initial start of the principles, and I expect that as we go through the design phase of this effort, there will be opportunity as well. As we try to put them into practice and we look at different designs, there'll be opportunity as well to come back to these principles and make any kind of tweaks to the extent needed. So with that, let's go one by one, similar to what we did in the December workshop. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the first principle here is the one in the bolded, and then a little explanation underneath it. But the first principle is that congestion revenue should be allocated in an equitable manner so as to avoid undue cost shifts. And this is where, in red line, we added between EDAM balancing areas, just to provide that clarity at this stage of what we're referring to in terms of cost shifts. This is mainly added at this stage because the congestion revenue allocation is allocated at the balancing area level and then is sub-allocated under the different tariffs of the participants. But it's also not intended to preclude, as we go down the evaluation of different potential design options, to the extent that there are some opportunities for more direct settlement. I think that can be explored, but at least at this stage, the idea is to try to avoid and mitigate cost shifts between EDAM balancing areas and ensuring that fair and equitable allocation of congestion revenues. Let me pause here just to see if there are any questions on this particular principle or the clarification. And this clarification, I think, was suggested by a couple of stakeholders. Not all of them come to mind. I know that 6 cities suggested it, and I think there were a couple of others as well, but we incorporated it here for clarity.
Taking a look, not seeing any questions coming in at this time.
Okay. And again, there'll be opportunity. I'll pause at the end as well of these principles. If anybody wants to take us back to any of the prior principles, we can cover that as well. But the next principle that we had is that the design should support the ability of transmission customers with firm rights or with CRRs to manage and hedge congestion risk exposure, considering grid conditions and feasibility of flow. And this is intended or seeks to recognize that CRR and firm transmission rights should enable a level of congestion hedge. It doesn't preclude or it doesn't try to prejudge the extent of that hedge. That we will work through the design, but that they provide a level of hedge under a design that we may need to look at. Yeah, let's take Dan's question.
Go ahead, Dan Williams.
This is Dan Williams from the Energy Authority. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So 2 comments here. One on the red text, which I think we support, but I want to make clear when we're sort of going through this that, and I think that 6 cities probably means this as well, that it's not so much about the EDAM BAs getting the equitable sharing or not having the undue cost shifts, but how that flows down to the either the CRR rights holders within those BAs, the load serving entities within those BAs, the transmission rights holders within those BAs. And at some point, we have to just make sure that we're developing paradigms that don't rely on the individual BAs to ensure equitability within their areas. So I'd be curious to hear what 6 cities thinks of that. But I can go on to the next one if that's good too.
Yeah, let's pause and see if we have anybody from 6. Oh, there's Meg. Yeah, we can go there.
Can we go to Margaret McNall, please?
Thompson Coburn for 6 cities. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so looking at this language, I think we're supportive as well, but I'd like to take a look at it offline to see if there are any further clarifications that we might suggest as comments after this meeting, and to further consider the framing that Dan raised. So not prepared to fully comment here, but we appreciate the addition and we'll take another look at this.
That sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Meg, and thanks for bringing that to the table in the first instance. And I think that sub-bullet, kind of gets to it too. It's that we're all sort of in agreement that we're looking for this fair and equitable allocation, kind of footprint wide, and then within the jurisdictions as well. So when it comes to the next bullet, we had made some comments in various places, whether it's at the Pacific Corps meetings or in some of the CAISO meetings, that just the OAT construct outside of California and the availability of firm transmission kind of varies by TSP across the West, and I hesitate a little bit to have us locked in on firm transmission rights as a bright line test for what allows you to have some ability to manage or hedge congestion risk, just because there are different ways that firm rights are awarded, different amounts of firm rights available in different BAs. And so I would like to kind of hold that a little less, a little less strongly, and maybe have some ability to look into how firm transmission rights are used and expressed across the entire EDAM footprint.
No, thank you for that, Dan. I think we can certainly consider it. Maybe if you suggest some tweaks to the language. The reason that we included this is I think traditionally, looking at other market constructs, firm transmission rights are the ones that confer you a level of hedge, not non-firm. But I know in past discussions, you may be interested in bringing towards discussion and maybe in the design stage some potential concepts to consider 6NN rights or something to that effect. And I think this gives us a little bit of room as we get into some of those design discussions to go back and, if need be, tweak some of the principles as we try to apply them towards different designs that we look at. But point taken, and maybe suggest that in your comments, and I would be curious what others think as well, especially as we get into the design, whether the scope of congestion allocation can apply to certain non-firm rights as well. But point well taken. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, just to be, try and be as clear as possible there, and I'll try to put this in some written comments as well. But the goal there is just to recognize that there are some instances where there are long-term commitments to fund the transmission system that don't always resort or don't always end up in an entity having the same type of firm transmission rights. But it's trying to find some consistency there for places where there are just specific situations that an entity is paying the long-term underlying cost of the transmission system, but maybe just isn't getting or having the flexibility to constantly express that through 7F or a 7FN product.
Okay, no, that's a good clarification. Yeah, I think there is room probably as we get into the different designs and we contrast it to potentially consider some of those aspects as well if they're narrowly defined as you suggest. So I think that's not incompatible in my mind with this construct, but we can try to tweak the language if needed, if you have some suggestions and how the stakeholders feel. So
thanks. I just wanted to be clear that I was not advocating for hourly short-term point-to-point transmission to be receiving congestion hedges, in case anyone took it that way.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And I'm not seeing any other questions coming in, so I think we can continue.
Let's go to the next slide. So this next principle is the one that garnered the most comment, and there were, I think, a number of entities, including Pacific Gas and Electric, Southern California Edison, San Diego, and maybe even I think DC Energy, if I recall correctly. But I think this is the primary one in addition to that first one, this is the primary one where folks sought some clarification, and I want to spend some time on this, and I encourage those that raise these comments to speak up, and maybe we can iterate on it here and align at least on its intent and scope. But the principle that we had is that the design should support continued administration of CRRs in the CAISO balancing area and the continued sale of OAT transmission rights effectively in the other EDAM balancing areas. And this principle sought to recognize that the design should be compatible with the underlying administrative structures of how transmission is handled within the different balancing areas. Within the CAISO, there's no pre-reservation of transmission service, but we have CRRs as a way to hedge congestion cost exposure. And in the EDAM entity construct who operate and administer and sell transmission under an OAT, this is the question that the design should be compatible and account for that sale and administration of transmission through that OAT construct. It was not intended to preclude any consideration of financial transmission rights or CRRs as a long-term initiative, but rather that it would be compatible with those continued OAT constructs. And the reason that I thought that this is important as a principle is that the EDAM is structured around certain independence of entities. Entities that join the EDAM, they continue to, they continue to administer their resource planning programs, their reliability function, transmission planning function, and as part of that, it includes the administration of their open access transmission tariff and the sale of transmission rights. The EDAM was not intended to supplant or remove that ability to continue to administer the OAT and the sale of OAT transmission rights. And I think what we've seen in other markets, like PJM, like MISO, who operate a market but also have an underlying OAT construct under which they sell transmission service, there's mechanisms there to go towards a financial transmission right or a CRR-like mechanism while also administering the sale of OAT transmission rights, whether that includes introduction of simultaneous feasibility tests, that includes setting expectations as to what level of hedge or what type of a hedge a type of transmission right confers to you. But that's what this was intended to capture, is that whatever we come up with needs to respect those concepts. It's not intended to preclude, but it's if we move towards if we want to move towards a financial transmission right or a CRR-like design, it should ensure that the OAT construct and the transmission rights that parties get is compatible with that, because the OAT transmission rights can confer you something under that construct. It doesn't mean that they need to stop selling OAT transmission service in order to move towards a CRR or a financial transmission right mechanism. And like I said, there's different mechanisms that we've talked about, I think partly in phase one of the initiative, partly the MSC, the governing body expert, and one of them is introduction of a simultaneous feasibility test that could account for the continued sales of OAT transmission rights, but recognizing that not all of those rights may be feasible, and subject to that test, you may not get as large of a hedge maybe as you otherwise could if you didn't sell that volume of transmission rights. So there's different constructs that we can evaluate, but we thought that it was important to recognize that any design that we move to on a long-term basis should not require the stopping of the sale of OAT transmission rights, but rather should be compatible with it. And there's mechanisms that we've seen in the industry that can achieve that. It's just a question of where do we want to go as we look at the different designs. So let me pause there and just to see if there are any questions on that, or if that explanation helps. The intent is not, like I said, to preclude consideration of CRR-like mechanisms, but it's intended to ensure that we structure that mechanism that it recognizes that their ability to continue to sell, and there's a way to manage the level of hedge that parties get under that construct with different, like I said, simultaneous feasibility tests, or how you structure the level of hedge that somebody that purchases those OAT rights gets compared to, a traditional CRR in the CAISO VA.
Taking a look at the queue, I'm not seeing any hands raised, and I'm not seeing any questions coming in the chat either. So I think we can continue.
Okay, we'll keep going, and then if I think we have one more slide of principles after this one, and we'll stop there and take additional questions if anybody thought of anything in the meantime. So the next principle that we have is that the design should not or does not impede the effective congestion management. And this is simply seeking to recognize that the design for the allocation of congestion revenues should not influence or impede how congestion is actually managed from an operational perspective within the market. That really the design that we're putting together is not dictating how to manage that congestion, but how to allocate the resulting congestion revenue from the operational management of the market and operations of the system. And we didn't have any comments on this principle in the comments. So the next one then, the last one on this page is that the design establishes proper incentives for economic market participation, supporting efficient market outcomes. And this one is more explicitly trying to recognize that the design should seek to really reduce or eliminate self-schedule incentives and support economic bidding and efficient market outcomes. That the mechanism for how you allocate those congestion revenues should create that incentive for economic bidding rather than for self-scheduling. And this gets at that concept coming out of phase one that we wanted to make sure that we try to address in whatever design we identify, is that it reduces or removes that self-schedule incentive and allows for those market efficiencies through economic bidding.
Looks like we did just receive a question
Go ahead, Dan.
Go ahead, Dan Williams.
Hey, Milos, Dan from DEA. So quick question, that second bullet there, was something like shift factor thresholds and kind of other modeling decisions sort of fall into that bucket? And I asked just because I think after we had the first meeting on this, and maybe somewhere around the time that comments were due, is when we had that CRR enhancements meeting, where that was kind of a, an hour or two of discussion there was around kind of how the models are, set up and decisions that are made around that, and then how that impacts kind of the performance of the whatever congestion paradigm set up.
No, good question, Dan. And this principle is not intended to impede, those modeling discussions. It's not intended to necessarily that this initiative shapes how each shift factor is established, but rather, the modeling of different facilities and their shift factor effects on each other is not intended necessarily to be defined by this effort, and that's independent of it. I don't know if that helps, but we were not trying to impede any adjustments to or any of that modeling of facilities and decisions on shift factor effects and thresholds.
Okay, yeah, that helps, and I guess we'll have to think more as we get deeper into it if there are, sort of some technical decisions that, that support or work for or against kind of the outcomes that we're looking for. But I'll keep thinking about that some.
No, that sounds good. Thank you, Dan, for that question.
I'm not seeing any other questions coming in.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this is the last slide on the principles, but the next principle is that the design provides a comparable allocation method for the CAISO balancing area that has that CRR construct, and for EDAM balancing areas that sell firm owed transmission rights. And again, this one seeks to specifically, more explicitly speak to one of those aspects that we wanted to address from the phase one design in whatever design we move to in phase two, but it's to recognize the need for greater symmetry in the allocation between the CAISO, which again doesn't have a free reservation or an owed-like reservation of transmission rights in advance, but rather has the CRR construct for managing congestion hedging, and those mechanisms of other EDAM balancing areas who sell transmission under the owed construct, that ultimately the design should create a symmetry in the outcomes in the allocation between the balancing areas. This is a little bit in concept redundant or similar to that first principle of equitable allocation and no undue cost shifts, but we thought it important to call out separately as well here, more explicitly in the context, recognizing that the potentially different constructs that different balancing areas in the EDAM have, you know, again, the CAISO without ode rights or without an ode construct, ode-like construct, and then EDAM balancing areas with the ode-like ode construct. And then the final principle we had introduced was that the design should provide transparency into footprint congestion or congestion across the EDAM footprint to support the ability of market participants to make decisions on how to manage their congestion cost exposure effectively. And what this principle really sought to do is that whatever design we come up with or enhancements to the design that we come up with, it should continue to support transparency in providing the necessary congestion data to enable market participants then to make informed decisions on how they manage their cost exposure to congestion costs. So it's really a transparency principle that, regardless of the complexity ultimately that we may end up from a design perspective, that it's important and critical that there be transparency into the congestion on the footprint enough so that parties are able to make informed decisions on how to manage their exposure. So a transparency principle. So I think this is the last of the principles that we had to walk through. Let's pause here to see if anybody had any additional questions that maybe came to mind as we walked through them.
Taking a look here, not seeing any questions. Just a reminder that you can raise your hand on the bottom right or type into the chat as well.
Well, thank you, Christina. So what we'll do next in terms of these principles, and I feel like, again, we're very close. There'll be another opportunity, as Christina will mention, once we get a little bit later into the next step slides, but there'll be another opportunity for stakeholders to provide any additional tweaks to these principles. At the next workshop, we'll dedicate a much smaller session to kind of where we ended up on the principles. But I think these are a good starting point with some of the tweaks that stakeholders have suggested. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, it doesn't preclude us from later tweaking the principles as we try to put them into practice or evaluate them against the different designs that we take a look at. There may be a need at that point to also make some additional tweaks to recognize certain flexibility or inflexibility that these may force us into. So we'll keep them in mind as we go through the different design evaluations, and always we'll come back to them and see whether we need any updates, recognizing the practical discussions that we'll have in the next stage here, looking at actual design concepts.
And it looks like we did just receive some questions. First, we have a hand raised from Alan Meck. Go ahead, Alan.
Hey, Alan Meck, PG&E. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Just one more clarification on the principles. Were these intended to be ordered in any kind of like hierarchical fashion? Like principle 1 is the most important, principle 7 is the least important?
Good question, Alan. No, there was no hierarchical ranking to these. It's more to help us evaluate how does the design fare across each, recognizing that some may be seen by different stakeholders as more important than others. But the ordering in this presentation was not intended to signify level of importance.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Alan. And we did receive a question in the chat from Daniel Slobodanyuk. He asked, regarding the reduction elimination of self-schedules, will this reduction elimination plan apply to the EDAM area or within the CAISO BAA as well? And this question is related to slide 18.
Okay, let's go to slide 18. And I think that's the one, that's the third principle on this slide. It's intended to apply to the EDAM footprint as a whole, that the design should not create incentives to self-schedule or should reduce those incentives to self-schedule in order to collect a congestion hedge. It should create incentives for economic bidding or allow for economic bidding and efficient market outcomes. So it would be applicable across the entire footprint, including the CAISO balancing area. Although, again, recognizing as to how each, how the CAISO may access congestion hedges may be a little bit different than under the OAT construct today. But once we evaluate different phase 2 designs, the intent again is across the entire market footprint that it should not create an incentive to self-schedule.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any other questions coming in at this time.
Okay. Well, thank you again for that discussion and the questions. And like I said, there'll be an opportunity to provide additional comments on these. I feel like we're very close. And I think what that would allow us to do is allow us to move to the next phase of discussions that I'll turn it over here to Hillary to talk a little bit about. But having aligned on the principles, we can then start focusing on design concepts and design ideas for either near-term enhancements and or long-term designs that for congestion revenue allocation post-EDAM go live. And I'll turn it over to Hillary to talk a little bit about how we thought about this next phase of discussion, because we do want to move now to the substantive part of evaluating design concepts, getting stakeholder input, and getting stakeholder participation as well in this next stage. So, Hillary, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Move to the next slide. So we'll wrap up here with some discussion of what we have in mind, as Milos said. And as we've discussed, this today is not going to be the end of the discussion on principles. We welcome further comments on that, and we'll review and continue that discussion in the next meeting. But looking at the overall level of support for the principles, we felt that this is a good time to pivot our upcoming working group meetings to focusing on solutions themselves, on the development and discussion of design alternatives. So what we're thinking here, and would be interested in your feedback on, is that the next upcoming working group meetings, we're going to be in parallel exploring both potential near-term enhancements, including those that Milos reviewed at the beginning of the presentation today, as well as long-term durable congestion revenue allocation designs. And the approach that we have in mind so far is from March into May to hold 4 working group discussions to flesh out the record on these design alternatives. At the end of those 4 meetings, pause, take a look at where the conversation is, and we can schedule more sessions if needed. If not, at that point, if we feel that we've covered enough of the issues that stakeholders would like to cover, we can capture that in an issue paper that looks at the different alternatives that are on the table, and from there, we will discuss how some of the ideas in that issue paper can eventually be converted into a proposal. So we're looking from March into May for 4 working group sessions to discuss solutions, and then moving there into the issue paper. So this is something we'd be interested in feedback on, whether you feel this is a good structure to move ahead with. And as Milos said, we really encourage presentations, design ideas, to the extent that you would like to present at one of these working group meetings. We really welcome that. So I'll pause there. Anyone else in the room want to elaborate on that, or any questions from stakeholders?
Yeah, let me just add one thing is that what that effectively gets us to is roughly every 2 weeks or so have a working group on this topic. And, it could be, depending on the level of stakeholder interest to present, these could be full-day discussions or half-day workshops. As Hillary noted, we would really love for stakeholders to present concepts, design concepts that address some of the issues and the principles, consistent with as much with the principles of where we should move in terms of design for phase 2. To the extent that stakeholders are not able to present, I think the ISO would be ready to introduce some concepts for consideration, but ideally, we would start here with stakeholders putting some concepts and ideas out for vetting amongst the broader stakeholder community. The ISO would also be providing input and comment and reacting to those, but we will always be ready to also introduce concepts as well for consideration, such that after these 4 working groups, we'd have established and vetted amongst ourselves some of those viable concepts, viable ideas, so then we can compare and contrast in an issue paper, and allows us then to better evaluate a potential proposal. We can have more than just these 4 working groups, like Hillary said, we'll evaluate where we are, but we really encourage stakeholders, if you're able and are interested, to put some ideas and concepts on the table that, as a stakeholder community, we can evaluate and consider.
We did receive a question in the chat from Alicia Vanoy asking, could you please restate when the meeting is that will present the additional CRR analysis? Is it the March 5th market update?
I don't know if it's yet on the what is it called, on
the calendar.
On the calendar. Maybe double check March 6th. But in the first portion of the presentation that Guillermo gave, where he noted that we will provide certain analysis of potential upper bound of cost impacts associated with the phase 1 design, which I presume that's what they're referring to, that will be shared at the MSC Market Surveillance Committee meeting that I believe, if it's not yet on the calendar, at least internally, it's in the works of being announced for March 6th. Is it on the calendar yet?
It's not on the calendar yet, but.
Okay, so plan on March 6th. It should be announced, I presume, sometime later this week, to the extent that the date doesn't change. But the idea is at the next public forum of the Market Surveillance Committee, which again at this stage is tentatively scheduled for March 6th.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any other stakeholder questions at this time.
Okay, so what we would do then on these next design phase of working group discussions is, as Christina will cover in the next step slides, we'll take one more round of comments on this particular workshop, and then based on those comments, as soon as they come in, we'll start to plan out and schedule the different dates for these working group sessions between March and into May. We'll look to cadence them roughly every 2 weeks or so between each other, but these are intended to be, less logistics, more substantive discussions. And the idea and the reason that we'll be making it every 2 weeks or so is it keeps it on top of our minds, and hopefully after these 4 working group sessions, we'll have a much better understanding of what's possible, what's the range of different designs that we could evaluate. So be on the lookout for more of those. After the comments come in, we'll look to schedule all 4 of them so that you have them on your calendars well in advance. Anything else to add, Hillary?
I think you covered it well.
Okay, we have Dan.
Yeah, we have another question that came in from Dan Williams. Go ahead, Dan.
Hi, Milo. So forgive me if you covered this at the start and I missed it, but in the EDAM clarifications filing that is at FERC right now, there's reference to the SP tie, gap tie methodology being transitionary, and we had talked about the ISO having a stakeholder initiative on that. Is that folded into this, or will that be its own sort of separate initiative to look at the modeling of intertie transactions in EDAM and impacts in the CRR market and that sort of thing?
No, good question, Dan. That will be a separate effort that we are planning to start in early March, starting with an educational session and then progressing from there. But that will be separate from this congestion revenue allocation effort.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Not seeing any other questions coming in this time. Does anyone have any final thoughts before we move to next steps?
Maybe before we move to next steps, just again, extend our appreciation to the stakeholders for participating in these last 2 workshops, for your comments on the principles and getting us to this stage where I think we're largely aligned on at least the initial principles to guide consideration of the design concepts. And we look forward to now jumping into the substance and and working through the design ideas that stakeholders may introduce or that we may bring to the table for consideration amongst ourselves. So really appreciate all the stakeholder participation and input to date. And Christina is going to cover some of the next steps in terms of when comments are due. And we're always open for any outreach, any questions, any help that you need with anything on this initiative. So feel free to reach out to us offline as well. And particularly if you're interested in presenting anything. And Christina is going to cover that here shortly. But thank you again on behalf of the policy team that's working on this.
Thank you, Milos. I just have a few next steps before we wrap up today. Reminder, please submit your comments in response to today's working group meeting by March 9th. We will post that template by tomorrow, so keep an eye out for that. And then informed by these comments, as Milos mentioned, the ISO will commence scheduling workshops to identify and discuss potential design alternatives. And then if you have any questions or if you're interested in introducing and presenting different design concepts, please reach out to us via ISO Stakeholder Affairs at CAISO.com. And also just a reminder that all meeting materials can be found on the EDAM initiative webpage, and the recording from today will be posted there soon as well. And taking a final look for any questions, I'm seeing none. So we'll move to announcements before we close out today's call. Just have some quick announcements. Here you can see some stakeholder meetings, comment deadlines, and trainings scheduled for this week. Here you can see information on market simulation meetings. And lastly, for insights into the ISO grid and market operations, be on the lookout for our Energy Matters blog, or you can always subscribe. Here you can see some of our latest blog posts. So with that, we'd like to thank you so much for joining today's meeting. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only, and all meeting materials are available on the initiative webpage, and the video recording will be posted there soon as well. We thank you very much, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
That concludes our conference. You may now disconnect.